Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar. Today, we're talking about feminist humanitarian funding approaches in climate and disaster crises. My name is Dr. Nicole Benham, and I am the Vice President of Strategy and Innovation at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. So glad you all could join us today. My pronouns are she, her. Before joining CDP, I was the Senior Director for Violence Prevention and Response at the International Rescue Committee. I have almost 30 years of experience working in the humanitarian space on issues of violence, including with a focus on violence against women and girls in multiple overseas locations in places as varied as Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Mozambique, and Jordan. I have worked on feminist partnership approaches to address violence against women and girls in humanitarian contexts, and I am very excited to learn from our distinguished guests here today. Please join me in welcoming them. A few housekeeping notes, though, before we get started. First of all, you can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end of the panel presentation. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the time allotted for this webinar. At the end of the webinar, there will also be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to meet your needs even better. And finally, we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. You can click on the closed caption / live transcript to access it, and these are available in multiple languages. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Philanthropy California, Philanthropy New York, and the United Philanthropy Forum, and we thank them all very much for their support. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders and past, present, and future generations. So at the end of this webinar, donors and listeners will hopefully have a deeper understanding of what a feminist humanitarian approach means, the challenges and structural inequities in the current mainstream humanitarian response structure, and lastly, how donors can incorporate feminist principles and approaches in their grant making. So let's take a look at the results of the poll. It was pretty straightforward. It looks like how familiar you all are with feminist humanitarian perspectives and principles varies, but at least the majority are somewhat familiar, which is a wonderful foundation to start this on. For those who are familiar and very familiar, we look forward to also any additional insights that we can glean from you in the future. And for those who are very unfamiliar and unfamiliar, you're in for a treat. So thank you for that. So before introducing our speakers today, I want to very briefly also provide some context and background to the topic. Here is how the Feminist Humanitarian Network defines feminism. They say, in part, it is about being intersectional, inclusive, holistic, collaborative, and committed. It puts women and girls, which means all self-identifying women and girls, and gender diverse people at the center. It ensures safety and safe spaces and accountability and transparency. And it recognizes power dynamics and shifts power where necessary. It is self-reflective, open, and adaptive. It's a poignant description. The Feminist Humanitarian Network also describes the key qualities of feminist humanitarian response. It is collectively and unwaveringly committed to achieving gender justice and responds to systemic drivers of inequality. It sees emergencies as catalysts to advancing the rights of women, girls, and gender diverse people and it actively shifts power to women-led organizations working in humanitarian contexts in the global South by ensuring that they are resourced and consistently included, and that their leadership is recognized and made central in shaping the humanitarian system. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guests who will bring many, many more insights to the table. And I'm really looking forward to the information they'll share with us today. First, Angelika Bilova. She is a Roma woman, a feminist, and a human rights activist. Angelika was born and raised in the city of Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine. In 2020, she founded the Roma Women's Organization, Association of Roma Women, or Voices of Romni, and became a regional representative of the Ukrainian Women's Congress, promoting gender equality and the protection of women's and girls' rights in Ukraine. After the large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, she continued to coordinate the work of her organization to provide humanitarian assistance to Roma in southeastern and western Ukraine. And Voice of Romni has helped more than 100,000 members of the Roma community, as well as other vulnerable groups. Welcome, Angelika. We're delighted you could be here. We also are so honored to have Dr. Peiyao Chen, who is the president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women. Peiyao has a 10-year tenure in leadership roles at the Global Fund for Women, including serving as the Senior Vice President of Global Operations. She is particularly interested in applied research that bridges academic knowledge with practical application to advance social justice. Over the past 3 years, she led operationalizing the Global Fund for Women's innovative new approach to center movements, including by helming the creation of groundbreaking tools such as the Gender Justice Data Hub, which identifies nascent gender justice movements around the world. And last but certainly not least, we are so excited to have Nadella Oya here with us. She is actively impacting the women's movement in the Caribbean. She is a dedicated strategist and advocate for gender equality and social impact, learning firsthand from Caribbean feminists and movement builders over 35 years. Nadella excels in crafting impactful strategies, that drive social transformation. Her expertise spans media production, social impact enterprise, and creative interventions with a strong focus on humanitarian, feminist, and gender issues. Nadella is currently the interim chair of the Caribbean Gender Alliance, and she also leads Create Future Good as founder and director, where since 2006, she has coached thousands of girls and boys on protection to realize their own power to break cycles of violence and harm. Welcome, Nadella, and thank you. So welcome to each of you, and we really are so grateful you're taking the time to share your expertise with us. I'm going to dive right into the questions now, beginning first with Peiyao. Peiyao, can you tell us what is the difference for you between a feminist response like I just described and a mainstream approach?
Thank you, Nicole, and really great to be here. So the current international humanitarian aid system has its roots in colonialism, and it largely assumes that affected populations, affected communities are vulnerable and need help. And this assumption and the principles of maintaining impartial and neutral continue to shape the mainstream humanitarian actions today. And feminist approach to crisis response really challenge these assumptions, principles, and actions. So on the screen, I'm going to highlight a few areas where feminist approach to crisis is different from the mainstream humanitarian response. So instead of external intervention, kind of help coming from outside, feminist crisis response really center crisis-affected communities and women-led organizations in decision-making. Instead of focusing on short-term relief of the symptoms of crisis, that crisis is short-term, that feminist crisis response really sees this as an opportunity, and we focus on long-term investment for community resilience against future crises. And this is really not about back to normal, as kind of really the focus on mainstream humanitarian response, because normal means the existing gender inequality will be reinforced. Feminist crisis response really seeks this as an opportunity to transform power hierarchies and structural inequalities that drive crisis in the first place. And the principle of neutrality and impartiality really, feminism is really about power. It's about power taking political stand against the power hierarchies and equalities. So instead of maintaining neutrality and impartiality, feminist humanitarian crisis really look for supporting gender equality, the rights of women, and the LGBTQI community.
Thank you for that really clear binary there to show us, yes, there is a certain approach, and that approach needs to be adjusted. And the feminist approach really brings those important adjustments and challenges assumptions. I really appreciated how you began with that. Nadella, in our planning discussions, you talked about the feminist principle of complementing and cooperating, not competing. Can you elaborate on that in the context of your work with the Caribbean Gender Alliance and in the Caribbean civil impact space?
Thanks a lot, Nicole. So in the Caribbean, which has a sort of patriarchal setup, but then when you look at the fact that, yes, we had indigenous folks and the Caribbean just ended up through enslavement and indentured labor, a whole metric ton of different people coming to the region. So there are many different influences. However, a lot of those influences and when you really go back into our different types of heritage, we come from very matriarchal societies. So there's this constant day-to-day kind of tension that you feel in your existence, where you know that women are sort of running things. We're running households, the economic part of households, not just the regular day-to-day cooking and cleaning. Women have really shone through very interesting nuanced situations throughout our history. In the Caribbean, there were these little pockets of times where there was a push in the women's movement for women to do better, learn more. Girls were learning differently. Whereas I can say safely, up to 100 years ago in the 1920s, women were considered property. So in just a short period of time, we're running things in terms of business and whatnot. And in the civil society space, not just in the Caribbean, but of course globally, people always think of, and I've heard it from funders, oh, we didn't expect these organizations to work so well together. And I think it's because, they came with this sort of mindset into a project that there would be competition for funding. But my experience has been that there's a bunch of us that prefer to work with each other because we understand the strength in working with each other. We also understand that we bring different skill sets and different positives to the table that we don't have in one setting. One organization or one umbrella body wouldn't have all of the strengths. So I have found that there has been this spirit of cooperation, of collaboration. And again, it's something that, we tend to, even in a colloquial way. And as, Payal said, we're dealing with colonial overtones and undertones when it is you're working in this space. And there are people that acknowledge that, but also understand that that's not part and parcel of how we would like to do business. And that's the thing. Civil society is in the business of making the world a better place. People talk about public sector and private sector, and I'm like, oh, hold on, there's a third sector. There's the civil society sector. And what we found is again, when we see where our work intersects, so again, in the women's movement, even with the Caribbean Gender Alliance, even the organizations that are part of the alliance, we understand, yes, we're putting women and girls first, right? But we do have to work with men and boys, that economic empowerment of women intersects with HIV/AIDS, intersects with LGBTQI. So we look at those areas of intersection in the work, and we play up on that, and we always amplify each other's strengths. There will be those that have a competing kind of mindset, but we understand that, and we just keep it moving forward in terms of who wants to work together to keep pushing things in a forward direction.
Thank you. I really appreciate you highlighting that point also, because the whole humanitarian system is so set up to compete, and yet a feminist approach can undermine that in a really positive way. So thank you for highlighting that. Angelica, as is sometimes the case in the midst of suffering, because of the current war and crisis in Ukraine, women have had a unique opportunity to show their leadership. Can you talk a little bit about how this has played out?
Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone, and my pleasure to be here with you today. First of all, answering this question, I'd like to say that our women were already active in their communities, although more often at the local level, and the full-scale war only highlighted this. We had no choice but to take a greater leadership role and grow as leaders. All women had to take responsibility for their families, to ensure their safety because their husbands went to the war, but also in armed forces of Ukraine is currently more than 60,000 women. Many women began to engage in humanitarian activities, volunteering, helping the civilians with various types of aid, evacuating people from frontline territories, representing Ukraine at the international level, asking international partners for military aid and raising funds to finance humanitarian activities. I would also like to answer this question through the prism of my own experience. I founded the organization in 2020 in the southeastern part of Ukraine in Zaporizhia when the war began. There were 4 of us in the team, and in 2 years, I increased my team to 60 people. We opened 4 regional offices, 3 of which are in the frontline territories, and 1 in the west part of the country where many internally displaced persons arrived and a largest Roma community live. We are currently working in 4 main areas. It is humanitarian activities, women's economical empowerment, preschool and out-of-school education of children from vulnerable groups, advocacy and leadership. And the cross-cutting priority is the prevention and combating GBV, a promotion of gender equality in the Roma community. And in 2024, Voice of Romani conducted a unique study of gender practices and experience of GBV in Roma community. And over the past 2 years, our organization has been conducting advocacy activities at such international events as UN forums on national minority issues, Ukrainian Women's Congress, Icelandic Women's Congress, Forum on Feminist Foreign Policy in Netherlands, UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York, Ukrainian Recovery Conference, etc. You can see some of the pictures on your screen. And during this time, we managed to help more than 100,000 people. All this work would not be possible with the support of our partners, CDP and UN agencies and others. And one of the most important factors in this leadership and is in our growth has been the fact that our team simply does a quality job, often on a volunteer basis, openly and accountable. And at some point, good recommendation and support from partners helped us reach the international level of advocacy and increase our influence, which in turn affected the amount of funding and helped more people.
That's the silver lining there is how many people you've been able to help, and also what a dramatic story of growth in your organization. For another webinar, it'd be interesting to hear how you handled that, but thank you for that overview. So Payal, back to you, if I may. How should funders think about risk differently in a crisis setting? I do think risk is something that funders are always thinking about. How can we think about it differently?
So when it comes to risk, donors tend to think about fiduciary and reputation risk. And this leads to the development of complex compliance systems, really lengthy due diligence process, complicated application processes. And these usually only the large organization that have staffing and resources can go through these processes and meet the requirement. Organizations that are local, that are embedded in the communities, that have the trust of the community, and who are usually the first responders to crisis and really understand the community needs, they usually don't have this kind of resources to go through the endless capacity assessment process or risk assessment process. So usually they are excluded from these kind of humanitarian aid. There's a report that shows that of the billions of dollars of humanitarian assistance provided in 2022, only 1.2% went directly to national and local actors. This is a problem. And this problem really required us to think about risk differently. And I think it's well established that local organizations are best positioned to respond to crisis. This is for community trust, this is for relationship, and this is also for rebuilding and sustainability. But really little of the money is going to local actors. So when we think about, when we rethink what risk mean from local actors' perspective, not responding in a timely way is huge risk, leaving people behind, not providing a timely response that meets community needs, or wasting the opportunity to transform existing power hierarchy and inequality. That's a risk. Not contributing to sustainability and long-term resilience, that's a risk. So when we start to think about risk differently, the approach to mitigate those risks is very different from the kind of risk mitigation strategy we have, which is the compliance system, the due diligence process. So that really help us think about how should we think about risk differently.
Yes, such a good distillation of, I think, many times the disconnect, right? And why it takes so long to get funding to people who need it right now. Thank you.
Nicole, you're muted.
Don't know why I did that again. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back to Nadella and ask, can you tell us about the impact of disasters in the Caribbean context, and maybe using the recent impacts of Hurricane Beryl as one example?
So Beryl did a thing. She did a whole number on us. And she first hit Grenada and St. Vincent, but more so what we would call the Grenadines, the smaller islands between St. Vincent and Grenada. And then, of course, she went on to Jamaica. And the thing is, people sometimes look at the Caribbean as, and it is a block, we're a region of very small and individual countries. We are individual nations. People think of the Caribbean as being, this touristy region, sun, sand, and sea. But there are many other types of industries throughout the region. Northern Caribbean is different to the Southern Caribbean. And then you have mainland Caribbean. You have Guyana and Belize and whatnot. So understanding the Caribbean is the first thing, in that where these small, and then what we would call the Eastern Caribbean, where they're the smaller islands, people are like, oh, these are just these little dots, on the planet. But those dots actually help feed millions of people. So for instance, countries just like Grenada and St. Vincent, islands and countries like Trinidad and Tobago, we rely on them for food. And in terms of how we're impacted, you're not just talking about people's roofs being blown away during a hurricane. And people, I remember someone talking about, the seasons in the Caribbean. I'm like, based on how close we are to the equator, we have two seasons, a rainy season and a dry season. And even without a hurricane hitting, if there is heavy rainfall and a high tide or a spring tide, we are getting flooding with water levels up to my neck in people's households. So all of your furniture and that then impacts food production, food safety. It impacts food prices. And for months after, the waters have settled, so it's something that we are affected. When one island is affected, the rest of the Caribbean is affected. And it's important to understand, I think, to bring it back to the whole feminist perspective, that, women are usually the ones that are leading the emergency response. And, you know, in terms of the structures, they're not always very effectively set up in the Caribbean. But on family and community and national and regional levels, you have the women that are kind of thinking through this thing. Yes, men are involved in the response, but we also have to think in terms of other dynamics. I mean, even up to like last week, and I have a friend from Grenada reaching out, a colleague and a sister reaching out, because even though they're in the midst of still recovering from Beryl, people are still sleeping in their cars, and because they don't want to leave their homes and their land for fear of it being vandalized or whatnot. So people are sleeping in their cars. Women were giving birth in the streets after the hurricane. But we are still weeks, a month and plus after Beryl, having to deal with trafficking of girls, because people become more vulnerable. They don't have the ability to stay in, and even without a hurricane, you have these issues. But with natural disasters, there's an advanced situation going on. So again, in practice, we've been leading the charge. But what I've found that is still, you know, a little heartbreaking for me is things still need to gel up. And yes, it comes through funding, but it also comes through, of course, long-term policy and whatnot. But things still need to knit up and gel up for us to be able to help each other, because Trinidad and Tobago would be well placed to assist Grenada and St. Vincent, again, in terms of trafficking issues and whatnot, more so than if it is you have organizations coming from the US who tend to have thinking, oh, you know, federal input could affect. No, you can't just roll into someone else's country unless it is you actually have permission. So that dynamic of being able to support each other, get help where there is help for the people who can help us, yes, but help us on our terms, right? There's a lot of times that people will bring their own constructs and where their comfort levels are to, and sort of layer it onto what is needed. No, we know what we need. We know how we prefer to work. We know how best to help ourselves and each other within the region. So it's about that listening air as well. So Beryl, in terms of, you know, how things impact, that's one recent one, but there've been hurricanes and earthquakes and all sorts of different things happening throughout the Caribbean. And how that impacts us is that even though we are separated by water and we are our individual nations, we still see ourselves as one region. In the Olympics, we're cheering for everyone's countries, you know, but we see ourselves as a region, and we are impacted economically as well as because everyone's families have been moving for generations, where there's still that connective tissue between the countries. So it impacts. Something happens. If Grenada sneezes, the rest of the region catches a cold.
Well, and the unity in the Eastern Caribbean region is something very interesting, I think, that many outsiders don't understand. I did want to highlight also, I appreciated very much in your answer that you brought out, I think, what is sometimes a hidden link between disasters that are like a hurricane or an earthquake, and then these other protection issues that come up, like the trafficking of girls and women that may be internal or cross-border, and that many times funders don't think about how dramatically that can increase in the wake of a disaster.
Yeah, and Nicole, very quickly, one of the reasons why, you know, I prefer to show these pictures rather than pictures of, you know, trees lying down is that these are actually young people from around the Caribbean that came together, you know, to assist in different areas. And so again, these are pictures of participants from at least 12 Eastern Caribbean islands. Yeah. So you have 120 of them, and they came to Trinidad and Tobago, and it was all to develop ways and means of how it is we can help each other. And they were younger participants. So again, rather than showing you know, the disasters, I wanted to show that we have the ability to work with each other and to solve our issues.
I love that. Thank you for creating images of empowerment and agency. All right. Angelica, back to you. you spoke last month at the Ukraine Recovery Conference about the need to include Roma women, specifically in Ukraine's future. Tell us more about the Roma people and what challenges they are facing within Ukraine currently.
Thank you, Nicole. So this was one of our most important international speeches this year because it made it possible to increase the visibility of the problems of the Roma community in Ukraine for international partners and the representatives of the Ukrainian authorities who attend this conference. And I focused on the key messages. It is investing in Roma women's leadership. It is very important to invest in it because, and I am also a product of such investments. What if there are 10, 20, 50 such organizations that annually help 40, 50,000 Roma, which work in several areas. And on the map, you can see the areas of our activity and geographical coverage. It is also long-term and flexible funding for Roma women's organizations. We need long-term funding from with IRC, especially in times of war when we may need evacuation or urgent humanitarian aid at any time. And as you see, so Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv regions, it is a frontline territories and my teams are there. And we understand how it is important for us. And it is a challenge every time, and we have evacuation plans for each team. It is also important that recovery plans, humanitarian response programs, etc., should be based on national needs assessments in all regions of Ukraine, not only frontline, and focus on the needs of vulnerable groups as Roma community, rural women, LGBTQI plus community, people with disabilities, elderly people. Combining humanitarian assistance and economical empowerment livelihood programs. And I also raised an issue of digital gap. Yes, in Ukraine is actively pursuing digitalization, but are the needs of vulnerable groups taken into account? And ensuring the rights of Roma is an important criterion for our EU membership. And regarding the most urgent needs of the Roma during the war in Ukraine, which we discovered during our latest comprehensive research, it is employment and decent payment. More than 65% of Roma people said that they had lost their jobs because of the war. Roma often suffer from discrimination in employment and often lack qualification, and therefore such projects as implemented by our organization for the obtaining of specialities, reskilling, retraining, assistance in employment, and the provision of business grants should be implemented at the national level. Access to education. More than 55% of our respondents noted that their children or the children of their relatives, friends do not go to school. The reasons are poverty, first of all. So it is impossibility to purchase any stationery, clothes and shoes for school. 51% of respondents do not have the necessary equipment for distance learning, such as gadgets, laptops, and even telephones, which has been introduced in many frontline territories. So we have a distance learning in Zaporizhia, for example, as in COVID-19, but now because of the war, because of the shellings, missile attacks. And we need national programs to improve Roma access to education. And about 50% of our respondents reported the problem of access to food and water. This in turn speaks of the importance of more advocacy in the humanitarian sector where the Roma often overlooked. And that's why currently we are working to achieve better coordination between Roma, pro-Roma, CSOs, authorities, international donors in meeting needs of Roma community on the ground.
Thank you. And thank you for this map as well. It really helps highlight where you're working, but also the the discrimination against the Roma across the region, but in Ukraine I'm sure has been very exacerbated by this conflict. So it's wonderful that your organization is there helping to fill the gap for that. I'm going to go back now to Nadella. Your organization includes children 7 to 17 in 50% of its strategic planning work. What feminist approaches are you applying in that space, and how do these improve disaster response and community outcomes?
If you can get them young, if you catch them young. I mean, I am laughing while I say that, but it is a reality. Us older adults, we a little hard in the head, as we say in the Caribbean. And it's actually about behavior and culture change. And if it is that you can work with the people, the older ones, because they are older ones, and we are very, very passionate about intergenerational learning. And so when it is because I have amazing mentors. I mean, I love the middle picture actually on this slide, simply because that's Jackie Burgess, who is a queen in the women's movement in the Caribbean. And the girl in green is my daughter. She's 18 now, but at that time she was probably about 10 or 11, and very actively involved in the work that we're doing. And the young man in the picture, he has sadly passed away, but also his mom, who also passed away, she was very active in the women's movement as well. And so there's learning within families, there's learning within communities, and for us involving young people and getting them thinking about their immediate environment, their family structures, the dynamics in families, if there's intimate partner violence happening, if there is family violence happening, what are ways that I can turn up to address this? How can I identify it, understand it on the personal levels, and then in your schools, in your friend setups, in your relationships as you grow up as a teenager, and then as young adults, and then older adults. That's powerful stuff. I mean, you said that you looked at some of the work from like our YouTube channel and whatnot, and our Facebook page, and us using popular media and those kinds of campaigns to bring about thinking about, something as simple as bullying, but how that again lends itself to the dynamics in intimate partner violence as a teenager. That helps young people get that mindset for when it is they go into older relationships or relationships as they get older, and they have the tools that they would have developed as young persons, something as simple as the concept of consent. Even though children aren't legally able to give consent, they are getting into, sexually violent situations as children. And so if they can navigate those concepts, it helps when they get older to be able to not only protect themselves, but advocate for their peers and their friends and whatnot. So the reason why is we look at at getting young people, and not just English-speaking Caribbean. We are part of Latin America and whatnot. Latin America and Caribbean is looked at as a block, and we have migrant situations happening, especially with the situations in Venezuela and Haiti and whatnot. So people are moving. So it's important for us to understand each other's cultures, to understand, like I say, individual dynamics, and to teach those feminist principles to boys and girls, but not just necessarily the principles, but also the important information to just help for healthier relationships and dynamics as they grow and move forward. So that's why it's so important for us, not just with the work of Create Future Good with children, but also with the Gender Alliance. And there's no way that we could do that teaching without involving them. They help us structure the language that they hear most readily. And that's why we have children very much involved in the design of content to help with behavior change as they grow older. The sidebar is that the adults get the information as well. So that's 2 pluses right there. So but that's our strategy.
Great, thank you. And one thing just to link together is I do appreciate so much the feminist approach in humanitarian contexts and beyond, and this explicit shifting of power dynamics. It also matters for age, it matters for so many different variables, and bringing young people into your strategic planning. What a wonderful way to shift power dynamics, among others. Thank you. All right, we'll go back to Angelica for this next question. And then after that, we'll have one more question and move to Q&A. So Angelica, how is multi-purpose cash assistance a potential feminist strategy? Can you share more with us on that?
Yes, thank you so much. So we started to work on MPCA at the late 2022. And during more than 1 year, we distributed almost $5 million to vulnerable groups in Ukraine with the focus on Roma community, IDPs, and other vulnerable groups. And I'd like to say that with the application of multi-purpose cash assistance, women's leverage in decision-making can be enhanced as their purchasing power increases. In an emergency response context, cash transfers can play a significant role in women's protection. They can help mitigate harmful coping strategies that are sometimes adopted or exacerbated by crisis. In a protection program, cash transfers can directly contribute to short-term outcomes, such as women using cash to avert life-threatening protection risks, for example, paying for transportation to escape unsafe households or communities, paying to access identification documents in IDPs refugee context, or paying for costs such as legal, transportation, and documentation costs in pursuit of justice. And I'd like to say that for us is also important for Ukraine, for our organization and other organizations who are working with IDPs and vulnerable groups, a comprehensive approach of humanitarian assistance, which is part of MPCA, also with other programs like livelihood programs, resilience program, economical empowerment, because the humanitarian aid, it is often emergency. It is an emergency help. So we have to provide it to protect people, but not to provide this help a lot of times. It is to give them emergency help in emergency situation. And I have a lot of different stories of our beneficiaries, but one of them, a woman from Donetsk region, her city is destroyed by Russia, and she moved to another region with her children. And he came to our regional office. He received an MPCA. Then a couple of times he received also other types of humanitarian aid. And then we proposed her to do retraining courses. And then he applied to receiving a business grant. And currently she have her own business and she don't need our help anymore. And I think it is very important to use this approach in such crises as in Ukraine.
Yeah, that story says it all. I think that multi-purpose cash assistance is transformative in so many crisis contexts. And thank you for sharing not only the data, but also the stories, as that really matters. Last question we will have, and then we'll go to Q&A. We'll try to keep as much time as we can for that. And so Payal, let's talk about feminism and funders. What would you say to funders who haven't thought about feminism as an approach to their funding?
Thank you for that question. And I think there are a few places to start. I think I will start with really expanding the definition of crisis to consider the systems of power inequalities and hierarchies that contributed to the crisis in the first place and exacerbated the kind of compounded the impact of crisis when crisis happen. So that's really the first place to really consider. Crisis is not a standalone incident, but it takes place in a context. I would also recommend that centering those impacted by the crisis in the design, in designing the crisis response and delivering the crisis response. And understanding crisis response as a pathway to gender transformative change. So when crises happen, gender roles start to change. And that's really a window of opportunity to promote women's leadership in crisis setting and challenging the traditional gender norms. Practice flexibility in terms of how and where funds are transferred, and also how funds are utilized. In crisis settings, kind of strict rules and guidelines on budget and spending, that's not effective in terms of crisis response. Flexibility is really key. Similarly, allowing for shifting priorities as crises evolve. In the beginning, it might be about immediate response and in the urgent needs and kind of the urgent needs. But as crises evolve, rebuilding and building resilience for the long term, that can be kind of the new priority as crises evolve. There are many crises that don't hit headline. And there are many crises that prolong for a long time that people lost interest. So I would really recommend focusing on crises that do not have the media attention anymore. And finally, local feminist organizations and feminist funds are well positioned to respond to crises in their communities. So I would encourage you to fund these organizations.
Thank you, Payao. And I'm so grateful you talked about the low visibility crises and also the long term. That is something at CDP that we're always trying to highlight as well, because it's so easy with everything else going on to forget about those that are not in the headlines or those that are ongoing. We may have turned our eyes elsewhere, but yeah, I do love how feminist principles can bring eyes back. While I have you, I'm going to go ahead. We're going to shift into the Q&A time. And I'm going to start with a follow-on question that was submitted actually ahead of time. Payao, if it's okay, I'll start with you. What do you think are unique opportunities for advocacy and grant making then that intermediary organizations can offer?
So I will give you an example of the work we do at Global Fund for Women. We are part of a collective of 14 feminist organizations, feminist funds, and we called ourselves Feminist Alchemy. So our goal is to build a coordinated and cohesive feminist crisis response that bridge both advocacy and grant making. So as a community of practice, we share knowledge and best practice to help strengthen our institutional capacity and during crisis response. And we also do joint advocacy. When united, we are stronger. So we leverage our expertise and networks to influence the global humanitarian sectors. In terms of grant making, some of us specialize in immediate crisis response and get funding to local groups within 70 hours. While some of us really invest in decade-long funding to lay the groundwork for social change before and during crisis event. So as a whole, each organization brings different strengths to the table. Collectively, we respond to immediate needs and also long-term building. So I think that's an example of intermediaries like feminist funds that they can create a more be more influential and provide more ecosystem response to crisis when we come to work together. And just one thing, we are, just put a plug here, we are publishing a report and also hosting a webinar in September to really share the feminist alchemy work, and we can share more resources after the webinar.
That would be great. I do think people would appreciate that who are listening. Another question that came in, Nadella, in our planning call, you actually said when people talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, the sea is often silent. What does that mean?
Everyone knows Central America, everyone knows South America as significant land masses. And when you look at the map and you compare it, the land mass in terms of the Caribbean doesn't seem that significant. And in terms of the populations, you have millions and millions and millions of people in these countries. And then in the Caribbean, some countries could be less than 100,000 citizens. Some fall within, the hundreds of thousands, and the bigger ones like Jamaica, Trinidad, you'll have like 1 million plus. And then when you look, of course, at like even Belize, even those on the mainland, you still have a certain type of population lean. Guyana has a big landmass, but a lot of that is rainforest. So in terms of our numbers, even when we show up in blocks, whether it's for, call anything, the OAS and whatnot, the Caribbean it's usually the Latin Americans are coming out. My Spanish brothers and sisters are very vocal and whatnot, and they're there and they're very represented. And the Caribbean tends not to be so represented simply because of numbers. And you also have where people create spaces. If they're engaging LAC, you'll find that they have things set up for the LA and not so much the C. And it's seen time and time again, especially in international organizations. So we just kind of have to jostle for our place at the table. Even though people are acknowledging a place for us in the name, it's not always put there. And we actually have, when it comes to assistance, because we're separated by water, it carries up the price of everything in terms of just movement, in terms of getting resources to persons, just the gas to go in a boat. If people in one island or one country want to help persons in another country, the expense of that comes with, marine fuel. And so there's just the understanding that the Caribbean bloc is a very powerful bloc. We have contributed a lot to the world over the centuries. We will continue to contribute. We just need to ensure that space is created for it and that we don't have to fight up so much. So that's what I mean by, sometimes the C is a little silent in the LAC, in the Latin American and Caribbean setups. But again, it's just for people to know we want to help. And we do need help. So there's that. And then just engage with us in the ways that we need, because we aren't going to have the exact same needs as the Latin Americans. However, they have acknowledged that the Caribbean is a huge part of the LAC as well, in the sense that, just again, using the Venezuelan situation and the migrants, the movement of people wasn't just happening in the neighboring countries for Venezuela. Trinidad and Tobago took on 60,000 additional registered on paper migrants during the last few years, and that's a big that helps. You feel it in the streets. You feel that refugee and migrant situation. So again, the Caribbean has Latin America sneezes, the Caribbean catches a cold.
Yeah, the interconnectedness of the region, I think, is profound. And then also one thing we talk about at CDP a good deal is the island recovery. Recovery from a disaster or crisis on an island is quite different. Angelica, one question that came in from the audience just now. Do you or any of the other panelists as well have any recommendations for women at the local level who want to create a feminist response to whatever crisis is affecting them? That might not otherwise catch the attention of a larger state or a nation government? How can they do that? And particularly in rural areas or where there's strong patriarchy.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. So, as I said in my first answer, this is really very important and crucial to do. I know that it is important to do the volunteer work. Of course, a lot of new initiatives, they don't have funds, they don't have grants, but it is important to do your work with other partners and to highlight it and to communicate it, because in our story of our organization was very important that we communicated and highlighted everything in social media. And a lot of partners and donors and authorities just saw our activities, and it was really very important for us. And then they just recommended us to others, and it is just communications and a proper work on the ground in your activities. And for our authorities, and for authorities actually, it is important also to have a good communication and coordination of authorities and international partners, donors, to have like list of recommendations and projects which you can recommend to CSOs, to new activists, to feminist organizations, and to recommend to fund them. For me also was important that I was, it was a lot of, it was night, and I was like searching in new initiatives and trainings, and the training programs. It is really very important part of when you're on the start, yes. And I'm learning and I'm attending a lot of training, and currently, because the work in CSO, it is every time it is a growth, and it is important to join like bigger initiatives. For me, in 2020, it was a superpower of women's organizations in Ukraine, and they have like a lot of clusters, and I joined one cluster, and I just funded organization, and it was a lot of trainings, and then they proposed us a small grant for a pilot project, and then a bigger grant. And that's why you have like a grant. We had a grant story for donors, and we had already our skills. So this is like the basic recommendations for those who would like to start their initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you. And it is a lot of word of mouth and snowballing, and yeah. So we have, I feel like an NPR interviewer here, but we have maybe 1 minute left. And Payal, there is one more question I'd really like to end with, if it's okay. Can you highlight any major philanthropic actors working in disaster relief, response, and recovery who you see demonstrating these feminist humanitarian principles?
So in our experience, we have seen so usually these are some private foundations, and definitely feminist funds are practicing feminist humanitarian principles. But in comparison, the amount of money they are managing, they are mobilizing to crisis response is so small in comparison to the field of humanitarian aid. Those is really dominated by government funding. And the majority of government funding go through UN agencies. Because of lack of capacity to support local organizations, therefore they got the money channeled through UN agencies. So as a result, so this is really that system. I think it requires all of us to really thinking about how to support and also advocate for that humanitarian system to democratize and to really open up to support local organizations. There are existing systems, one of them being the feminist ecosystem, to provide these kind of resource mobilization, channel money to local grassroots effort, but it's not happening yet. So this is a lot of work remain to be done.
Yeah, despite a lot of emphasis on local organizations and feminist principles, we still see the bottlenecks and the drip feeds. But we're looking forward to continuing to change that. So I really want to thank all of you so much for joining us and for answering the questions. I think we do need to transition now. Quickly, I want to talk about next steps and actions that people who are still viewing can take. Please recognize the value of supporting women and girls and gender diverse communities, understanding their perspectives and becoming more aware of the value that those bring. Reach out to potential partners and allies to learn more. This is how we all learn, by talking and by approaching each other with an open mind. Increase funding to organizations supporting and also led by women and girls in gender diverse communities. Just start funding them. Payal ended us on a really good note for that. Let's not keep those bottlenecks and drip feeds going. You can find many resources that can assist you on CDP's website, issue insights, disaster profiles, our playbook. We have all kinds of resources that we would love for you all to access. Very quickly, We will have our next webinar, but we're going to be taking a break from our regularly scheduled webinars in September, and we'll return in October 10th. We'll be looking at this year's theme of Disaster Risk Reduction Day, the role of education in protecting and empowering youth for a disaster-free future. And then a reminder that on November 14th, we also have the futurist Trista Harris of Future Good, who will join us in a fireside chat as we reflect on 2024 and look forward to 2025. Thank you so much. In order to respect your time, I'm going to have to close, but we really appreciate you joining us today, and we look forward to you joining us for our next webinar. Thank you.